Go for it.
Good morning, everyone. We're back. CJ and I have returned with the man of the hour. He needs no introduction here. If you've been following Paul, I'm telling you right now, especially today, guys, not only do you need to get your notebooks out, you need to go to the SiriusReport.com. You need. CJ, I know people that have subscriptions to video services that they barely watch. I know people that have subscription to music services they barely even utilize. In this day and age, with the massive confusion, the hysteria, the chaos at full tilt, you need intelligence, you need perspective, you need gravitas, the likes of which you've never needed before. Go to theseriesreport.com, subscribe to their premium membership service, and you're going to get a daily briefing. It's like getting a presidential briefing every morning, every day, where Paul break down the entire geostrategic playbook and explain to you what's going on. This is a real, educated, sharp, insightful report. This is not some guy out there screaming on the top of his lungs telling you that the world's going to end tomorrow. This is not some character telling you that, you know, the events that occurred in Syria was to scare the Russian and the Chinese. That is utter nonsense. Earlier this morning, guys, I said one way or another, the cabal is going to get destroyed. One way or another, the cabal is going to be taken apart. The choice up to us here in the United States is whether we're going to be a part of that. With or without us, it's going to get done. And Paul's going to break down the whole entire thing, what's going on in Syria, what happened to the buildup, and where we go from here. So without further ado, Paul, welcome back.
Well, good morning, and thanks for the introduction. It's very kind to you. But yeah, what we'll try and do is be very calm, very collected.
Yeah.
I know it's kind of an emotive subject, and everyone's very, very disappointed in what Trump's done, and of course, it's kicked off this whole conspiracy that Trump was this and Trump was that. And so maybe we can just start with Trump the person. Now, he still remains a non-capitalist. He never was. It's not like he's, the wolf in sheep's clothing and he's taken it off and said, hello, I'm going to, tell you everyone in the world who I really am. No. Where the problem stems with Trump is, and I kind of reflect upon the choice of language he used when he kind of justified why this attack happened in Syria. And the one thing he really pointed on about was the children, the children, the children.
Right.
Now, we know in legal terms, and I went and talked to someone about this and said, in legal cases where there's children get murdered or something happens, it's very often the case where the prosecution will hammer to the jury the angle of the child, what happened, and really do it graphically so the jury's going to weigh heavily on their mind. Now, the fact Trump comes out with this kind of rhetoric shows that whoever he was talking to was pushing that agenda with him very, very hard. Now, we all know that what happened in terms of the attack. We know that the US launched the Tomahawk cruise missiles. We know clearly, and we've had from Russian intelligence, and it's absolutely correct, that the Syrians warned the US prior to this that they were going to bomb this base, or what they thought contained weapons. It turned out, obviously, there was some residual chemical weapons there. Is it sarin gas? No. What is it? Could be phosphorus. We don't know exactly, but of course, what that is, that released some residual chemicals into the atmosphere. Now, we know subsequently that this was turned into a false flag. There was, the white helmets were turning up saying it's sarin gas, not wearing any protective gear. Well, that's absolute nonsense. Either that or they're superhumans from planets somewhere in the universe where people can withstand this. That's simply not true. We know that for definite. What we can also say is with categorically, this wasn't some grand design between Putin and Trump to try and somehow play some game with the cabal. Absolutely not. What happened is obviously these series of events happened. Trump has an inner circle of people. Now, clearly, he was given some very, very poor advice, and that's being diplomatic. We can use far stronger language than that. Now, within the inner circle, there was this huge conflict of viewpoints as well. Some people were saying to Trump, don't listen, this is absolute nonsense. This is false flag. This is rubbish. We've seen it all before. In 2013, we had the same rhetoric. It's classic MO. Let's use a false flag event to try and blame something on Assad. I mean, we've seen it countless times, so this is hardly new. Now, there's the flip side of people in his inner circle who were saying, no, this is factual. And they were giving him evidence. They're giving him this rhetoric. And Trump, being the human being he is, despite what people may dislike him and loathe him or like him, that influenced his decision. So and also, we should go back to 2013, and it's a world of difference to be sat there wherever Trump was in Trump Tower tweeting away about, Obama, you shouldn't do this, and Obama, you shouldn't do that. When you're in the pressure cooker environment of being the president of the United States, you're getting all this information thrown, you're getting all these conflicting opinions thrown at you. He subsequently made a very, very bad decision, and in ways that will linger on probably for months and years to come. The ramifications of this, and we can start to talk about that, will become self-evident also to Trump. Now, the problem is within this inner circle, the question then is, that people speculate, well, who was giving him good advice, who was giving him bad advice? From my perspective, we can kind of try to dissect that.
Sure.
But it doesn't really matter ultimately if it's one person on one side, one person on the other. The point was he's being duped. Now the question is, or people will say, was this erroneous advice genuinely? I could get told something and reiterate it to you, to CJ and V, for example, or I could tell the audience where I genuinely believe something to be true, but in fact it's complete erroneous, and in fact it might be an utter lie. Or was the advice he given deliberately coached and engineered in a way to make him take the action that he did? Because I think undoubtedly, he believed the intelligence he was given Trump. He acted accordingly. Of course, it was absolutely the most crassly stupid thing he could ever have done. Probably far more ridiculous than a lot of the insane decisions that US presidents in the past have made, and also presidents and prime ministers across the world. But it's absolutely crazy. But, so it seems incredulous to people to imagine he could be suckered into believing that this was a possibility. And we've talked about, all the reasons before as to why, how could anybody believe it? I mean, all those logical reasons that said, hang on, a few days ago, basically the US said, we're not interested in regime change. We're not going to get rid of Assad. We don't see him as a threat. The primary threat is we need to deal with ISIS and let the Syrian people deal with Assad. And then obviously a few days later, of course, this attack happens, and suddenly the US turns full circle and goes, now we want regime change in Assad out. Now, you'd think logically anybody would sit back and go, hang on, you cannot seriously believe this. You must reflect back in history what's happened with Assad, where he's been blamed for chemical weapons attacks when the UN subsequently went, well, actually, no, that's absolute rubbish. He didn't do that.
Right.
But of course, in that pressure cooker environment, he didn't think the way we'd expect. I think he got a lot of influence from people in his inner circle who he trusted and believed. And I said the rhetoric coming out talking about the children in such an emotive way, I think was one of the ways that he was convinced. Even though all reasoning suggests obviously completely opposite. We know all the arguments and that Assad clearly absolutely wasn't responsible for it. But he made that decision. Now, of course, then the question that came out was, okay, so he makes the decision, they launch this attack. And of course, people rightly said, well, hang on, I didn't see much damage in this airfield. So, there must have been some concocted story between between Putin and Trump. Well, no, the reality was the US launched all these Tomahawk cruise missiles. What prevented most of the damage was the S-300, S-400 defense systems. They took most of these missiles out.
Okay.
Yeah, they mitigated most of the damage. This is why it looked in theory, and you're absolutely right. People on face value will go, how the hell could the US have launched all these missiles and not to achieve the aim of destroying this airfield? But of course, that's the reason why, because these air defense systems are very efficient. Now, by all accounts, we don't know exactly how long, but the Russians were given notice of this. I understand it's probably about half an hour to an hour's notice. Now, if they'd been able to mobilize more air defense systems quickly, the chances are there would have been literally no damage, because these air defense systems do work extremely well.
Oh, they're the best in the world.
Now, yeah, by a long shot, which is why every other nation in outside NATO, well, in fact, some NATO nations talk about buying them because they know how successful they are in terms of their, what they're supposed to achieve
Yeah.
and their objectives. So that was what caused a massive load of confusion as well, is that people thought there was some kind of plot going on, and it was an attempt to try and divert the neocons. And then the flip side is he's not a neocon. Trump just made an idiotic decision. Let's not mince our words. It was stupid, it was ignorant, and it was very naive. But he did it with the best intentions. Now, of course, those intentions were completely flawed and utterly, utterly wrong, without any shadow of doubt. And those people, you get old people say, well, people like you supported Trump. We always made the point, we supported Trump when he did the right things. When he does the wrong things like this, then absolutely we're going to say this was an insane, ridiculous decision. And of course, the ramifications are going to be huge as a result of this. Now, so that kind of sets a bit of the backdrop as to why Trump made this decision. And, logically, yeah, it makes no sense. I kind of woke up in the morning and went, why the hell did he do this? This is absolutely insane. But then you have to take a bit of a step back and try and understand exactly as what's occurred. Now, of course, the bigger problem is, okay, so he makes this decision. Now, the question is, he's got a number of choices. Does he carry on with this policy? And we've heard they're steaming off to North Korea. No one really knows exactly what they're doing. Well, the bad news for the US is the Russians and the Chinese have telegraphed this, and they're quite happy for the Americans to go steaming off to North Korea,
Right.
Because yet again, it would be another insane decision if they started to embark on some military action. They've talked about perhaps more military action in Syria. I mean, and once again, another absolutely crassly insane decision if they choose to do that. But the timing as well, notwithstanding the fact it should never happen, the timing of doing it when the president of China, Xi Jinping, was in Florida with him, was probably one of the biggest, most spectacular own goals you could do politically in terms of foreign relations, because from the Chinese perspective, it's like the ultimate slap in the face.
Correct.
You invite us over. Yeah. You invite us over. We're supposed to have all these trade talks and talk about things. And you come and tell me, oh, by the way,
I just launched some I just launched some 40-year-old cruise missiles into a desert.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're perfectly happy with that, given that Syria happens to be one of your major allies, and you do a lot of trade with it. You're looking at wanting to rebuild Syria and help them in the future. So to put it mildly, and the Chinese are very, publicly they're very, very diplomatic, but privately the Chinese were absolutely apoplectic about this.
Wow.
They, on so many levels, were they furious about it. Now, obviously, on the flip side as well, the Russians were absolutely livid and furious. Now, the reason why is multifold from a Russian perspective, because the Russians said, look, to the Americans, we have the intelligence, we have the information available to prove that this was not a SAN. Of course, they just completely ignored it. They weren't interested. Now, as far as we're concerned, we're not interested in that. Obviously, the fact is that some people say, well, they informed the Russians and gave them some notice. That was partly, I think, to make sure from a Russian perspective there wasn't any collateral damage, because they were terrified of doing that to the Russians. But they were clearly aimed at.
My inside source said that the Russians got the heads up as soon as the missiles launched, so they only gave them a 20-minute window of opportunity.
Well, that's even late. I mean, I'd heard 30 to 60, but 20. Yeah, that would make even more sense why they didn't react quick enough to. I mean, they did a damn good job in taking out a lot of the missiles. Of course, the Americans are never going to admit, oh my God, we launched all these missiles. I mean, they kind of said, oh no, they reached their target. Well, where was the target? And the Russians very codedly said, well, tell us where the rest of the missiles went. Of course, Washington remained pretty silent and said absolutely nothing.
Well,
for
one of them
ended
up in a man's turnip garden. Did you see that one?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, as well as being a number of Syrian servicemen killed, yeah, there were some, civilians killed as well. And from my perspective, one death is one too many. So, I mean, yes, in the grander scheme of things, it could have been infinitely worse than it was. But but unfortunately, there was a lot of mitigation, but of course, anybody dying is hugely regrettable, particularly in the context of what's happened. So we look at the context of that. You've got the decision that Trump's made. So if he carries on and says, "Well, I'm going to believe this intelligence, and I now think that North Korea is a problem. I'm going to go in and have regime change in Syria." That would be a spectacularly stupid decision to make, because it would just further rile and antagonize Russia and China, who both are absolutely furious.
Right.
And we've got, I mean, and here's the point that comes out of the thing. People will reflect on Xi's visit to the US and to Florida and go, well, the Chinese came out with all these statements. Well, here's the question. If everyone thinks that, everything's fine and dandy with the Chinese, there was no joint press conference that came out of
Yeah.
this meeting. Now, I mean, we all know, from a Trump perspective, how much, there was very much bad blood between himself and Merkel. But at least they had a joint press conference, even if it was a bit of a facade. But no joint press conference. They were, to say they were absolutely livid is an understatement. And likewise, Russia was absolutely furious. So there was no grand scheme of trying to fool the neocons and make them believe that Trump was on side. No, Trump, as we said, made an appallingly bad decision on every single level. So, as we say, he carries on, or he's going to have to purge his inner circle and realize the people who are on side and trying to do the right thing, and then conversely to remove the people who are on the wrong side of the equation. Now, from what I understand, that's very likely to happen. Now, we'll watch with interest as to who the casualties are. There's certainly, we can speculate. I mean, there's a lot of speculation going on about Bannon, why Bannon kind of stepped back from the NSA. I think actually that was a coincidence, but what we can say is Bannon was very much anti going into Syria. He thought it was absolutely a ridiculous thing to do, which of course it
Right.
is. Now, and we looked at the people. The other thing that's interesting isn't this kind of something. I looked at the kind of contingent of people who were in this kind of meeting of the inner circle. The one thing on that day that I found very interesting is there was not a single CIA presence in that meeting. Now,
Mm-hmm.
this probably is the most surprising thing. From what I understand, the CIA actually said, "Commend you launching this attack in Syria."
What do they say? CIA says
Yeah,
command.
the CIA said, "We do not recommend you launching this attack in Syria."
Wow,
I
even
mean,
the cocaine import agency said that.
yeah, they just thought this was a very bad decision. Probably also concurs with why there was no, they had no presence there. Yeah, there's this inner circle of people. There's 12 of them, but yeah, no CIA presence.
You know
Interesting,
what?
of course. But
Everything you just said, like right now, everything you just said was communicated to me via email by Harley Schlanger, who's connected to the very architects of the Silk Road. And and Harley said the same thing. The Chinese and the Russians are livid. They believe totally that Trump was given wrong information. And here's a concern. Now there's a precedence for ISIS that if every time they want America to intervene on behalf for them and for their interests, all they got to do is set up a false flag. All they have to
well,
do is
yeah,
set up. Hmm.
exactly. And the point is, at the end of the day, who were the winners in this whole
ISIS.
Syrian debacle? Yeah, you got the terrorists on the one side, and what's left of the neocons in Washington. They're the big winners in all this. No one else. I mean, the US has done themselves absolutely no favors on a world stage. And of course, we come back to this whole flip side. When China and Russia reach breaking point, I mean, they're the two allies that Trump desperately needs because, contrary to most people's view, the US is a very weak nation. It's economically weak for all the reasons we've discussed
Correct.
countless times. It's politically weak because Trump is obviously being under attack by the neocons and everyone else to get him out of power. Militarily, it's weak because it's been so underfunded and it's in no way, shape, or form capable of taking on the likes of Russia. It might, it claims, and it might want to shout its mouth off and claim to the contrary, but we know that's not true. It's got huge social problems. So the US, contrary to most people's viewpoint, is very weak. It needs allies like China and Russia, because it's very important that they team up with them and start to work with them. Now the Russians and the Chinese were very confident they'd started to see that. Now, of course, this happens. They appreciate Trump's is just being duped in this matter. They realize it, but they have to act according to what the administration does, not the perception of who Trump actually really is. So the basis of this is set back U.S. Chinese and U.S. Russian relations light years. I mean,
I believe that.
Cold War is not the issue anymore. This has gone way beyond Cold War. They are that furious and livid. So the question then comes in: okay, what exactly are Russia and China going to do? Because there's going to be a reaction. You can guarantee, and they're not going to do it when the US expects it. I think they're quite happy, for example, for the US to go storming into North Korea. I think they're going to set some traps there for them.
Yep.
Rather like the whole Ukraine thing.
I was just about to say that. Yep, Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I liken Ukraine from a cabal sense to be the sucker punch. Syria will be the knockout punch that takes the cabal down. Now, and I heard you earlier because I listened to the show you did with CJ. You made the point when we started. The cabal's going to go one way or the other, either with the help of the US or not. And we've said before, if Trump's in power or not in power, it makes absolutely no difference. The only thing is, from a US perspective, it's best to have the Russians and the Chinese on side. But if Russia and China want to take, all they've got to do is wreck the dollar, and it's game over.
That's it. That's it. I was having this conversation with a family member last night, and one of the things I said, well, if McMaster's plan is to commit 150,000 troops, and President Jared Kushner has the idea to put 150,000 troops in Syria, the Russians are not. Putin's not stupid. He's not going to go thermonuclear with us because he's not death obsessed like the neocons are. Putin and Xi, they will fight us asymmetrically, just like they've been doing us, taking us out in Ukraine, just like they've been doing even in Yemen. How China is actively involved in Yemen. Dragonwater is actively involved in Yemen. That's the Chinese private securities firm, and you see what's happening with the Saudis over there. If we commit 150,000 ground troops, that will be the best thing that will happen, and we will play right into Putin's hand. They will lay traps. Syria will be the trap that takes us out, because this elephant has a very soft underbelly, and that's economics. And we don't have a $16 trillion a year economy, Paul. I believe we have anywhere between a $5, maybe $6 trillion economy currently when you count in all the debt. And I think that at least $1 trillion or more is spent on defense. 711 billion plus another a couple hundred billion on quote unquote intelligence. I use that word euphemistically. And I think that's what we have here. I think this is going to be a perfect trap. Let the empire of chaos overheat. Let exceptional stand bleed themselves dry.
Sadly, you're right. It's true. It's absolutely correct. I mean, and the one thing that China is appalled about is not just in terms of the action, and Russia for that matter. It was the fact that it was carried out without a shred of viable intelligence. The Chinese and the Russians going, hang on a minute. So this chemical attack happens, and you reckon literally 48 hours later, oh, we're all ready to launch an attack because we have all this intelligence. Now, from the Russian and Chinese perspective, they're going to look at Trump and go, hang on. We can accept the fact it's a pressure cooker environment, but you really didn't give any consideration to the fact that there was no evidence. I mean, where was the boots on the ground, for want of a better word, of people who are taking samples, getting a proper assessment of what's going on? There was none of this. And, and of course, the Chinese are livid because, from their perspective, whether the US likes it or not, they do see Syria as this strong ally. They want to work with them. And the Chinese, the Russians have a very overt military presence, but China has a very strong kind of economic presence as well in the Middle East. Hence why, it's like, well, not just the Middle East, across the entire world, the Russians and the Chinese have spent the last 2 or 3 years, particularly putting their foot hard down on the accelerator with all the trade deals, the de-dollarization. But we talk about key events, and we spoke recently where Ukraine was a huge turning point in terms of destroying the cabal. Well, for me, the actions in Syria, what is the final nail that will take the cabal down. Now, from Trump's perspective, the only option he really has, whether he's prepared to take this, he's allowed to take it, is another matter. He has to do the biggest 180. He's going to have to hold his hands up and say, we badly screwed up. He's not going to do this, but this is what he needed to do, because if he doesn't, from the Chinese and Russian perspective, that the trust has gone.
Yeah,
So the
and
angle is,
another thing I want to take, another idea that I want to take apart. I mentioned this before, and I don't think many people gotten this. There's a lot of rhetoric out right now where people are saying, "Well, this gets the Russian narrative off Trump's back." No, it doesn't. His opposition in the media, his opposition in the far left media, they are insatiable. So now they realize, hey, they can push President Trump's buttons. What else could they push his buttons on? This leads them to all sorts of vulnerabilities on one side. On the other side, you have terrorist groups that says, oh, all we have to do is set off more, quote unquote, chemical attacks, or what appears to be chemical attacks, and then Trump would have to respond because he's already laid the precedent. Oh, look, a chemical attack went off. I quickly responded by launching missiles. So now the world expects him to do that. It's a dangerous, slippery slope here, Paul.
Oh, hugely. And he has. You're absolutely right. He set the precedent. What happens if there's another, story that comes out there was a chemical attack? What's he going to do? Immediately launch more missile. And of course, we've got the interesting perspective that Tillerson's due to meet Lavrov on tomorrow and obviously Wednesday. Now, I don't think there was any plan for Putin to meet Tillerson as well, and apparently Putin's not meeting Tillerson. But you can bet your bottom dollar that when Lavrov meets Tillerson, Tillerson is going to have thermonuclear ears by the time the conversation's over, because he will be read the riot act. There is no doubt.
Oh, yeah.
Russia
Lavrov
will make it.
Get him alive.
Yeah, he's going to make it abundantly clear that this will not be tolerated anymore. If you decide to launch missile attacks, we will respond with a program, not just in terms of defense, capability. They will respond. They have had enough of this. And if Trump thinks that America's just going to stand there and this is going to be tolerated, he's got another thing coming. The question is, how quickly is he going to wake up to the reality of that this was a crass, insane, stupid decision to make?
It's so dumb on so many levels. Like, go ahead, Paul.
No, but yeah, absolutely. It's dumb in respect of the action they actually took, the precedent they've set. It's dumb in terms of international relations. The two nations they desperately need as allies, they've alienated. And the question is now, okay, there's going to be probably some economic response. When's that going to happen? We don't know, but it's for certain. There is also undoubtedly, we're going to see a leak of intelligence that's going to come out, that's going to finger the US, and the world's going to go, hang on, this is the reality, and we've been lied to. The damage that will do to the US as a nation could be incalculable. Now, bear in mind, these nations don't have a problem with the American people, but whilst you have this insanity that is either trying to pull the levers, as we see with the Trump administration or in previous administrations, was fully in control. They don't care, because the reality is, look, we have this huge problem. It's not going away. We're not going to see any change of policy, and they were prepared to give Trump the benefit of the doubt. They saw encouraging signs. Yeah, there was all the rhetoric with China, but that's all it was. The reality is, Xi went to thing. They had conversations. It's pretty obviously China walked away and gave him the cold shoulder. Yeah, we'll hear about China doing all these China trade deals, and we'll hear all this rhetoric. The reality is they left, and basically, rather like what Lavrov's going to do to Tillerson, Beijing did exactly that to Trump. They walked away, and that's why there was no joint press conference. That, in political circles, is a huge slap in the face, which obviously a lot of people won't realize that was the case. But that's absolutely true.
What type of a moronic move is this? Here you have the creditor nation, okay, the president of the creditor nation, which is China, coming to the debtor nation, which is the United States. He gets he waits around for an hour for the leader of the debtor nation to show up, and the leader of the debtor nation, shows up and says, "Hey, look what I can do," and launches off cruise missiles at the creditor nation's ally. Who in
Exactly.
their right mind thought that this was a great idea? Is beyond. This is a foreign policy disaster. The inside neocons are laughing their heads off at Trump. He's failed on all levels.
Oh, absolutely. And just to make it, I mean, Russia also kind of was so furious that obviously the US chose to ignore Russia's data and intelligence, which presents irrefutable evidence. But also, they're absolutely livid to find. And this, how often does this happen? The US launches some strike, and on the back of that, when there's all chaos ensuing, we see the Daesh and all these terrorist groups launching in the vicinity of that area another large-scale offensive against Syrian defensive positions. And
Right, and that
and,
and
and
that defensive position, Paul, was defending a Christian village against ISIS.
yes, and exactly, and these are supposed to be a coincidence, and that is what is infuriating for the likes of Russia and China. Is yeah, people can make, but hang on, just look at this objectively. I mean, is we seriously trying to say there was no communication between the US, whoever took out these missile strikes, and these terrorist organizations? I mean, what are the odds that they, on the back of this, they suddenly
Mm,
launch a large scale
wow.
offensive?
Wow,
I mean,
you are absolutely right. There's the proof in the pudding. Wow.
yeah,
Wow,
well,
Paul, you just
absolutely.
I'm in shock. I completely didn't even see that. Wow.
Well, I mean, it's just, and the thing is, what I find frustrating is for year after year, it's the same MO. It's the same, and I'm going to use the term bullshit. We get told, oh, there was this attack. Oh, and it was launched by a set. And there's always all the contradiction. There's always the proof that in fact, no, it wasn't. And undoubtedly, I think there was an opportunity seized by it where they thought, okay, we can now finger Assad, blame him for a chemical weapons attack. There was no evidence, and there is no shred of evidence. And here's the point: Assad was on the verge of winning this
Yes.
war. He's got all. I mean, whether people like it, he didn't remain the leader all these years, 5.5 years, or however long this war's been going. Where he's got nearly everybody in the nation approves of him. They want him as the president. He's going to stake all that to kill a few hundred people of his own people. Why would he do that? Even if he loathed and detested the people in his nation, which he doesn't, there's not one shred of common sense that he would then go and upset the Americans, knowing full well what the consequences would be. It's insane to think that he would do that. So there's all these insane things that have gone on. And that is what frustrates the world when they see Trump going, hang on, I didn't see this. Okay, you could make this a completely insane decision. But you'd think now, the number of days later, upon reflecting on this, you'd sit back and go, okay, well, let's find out exactly what in the aftermath has gone on. Let me assess what the Russians have provided us in terms of intelligence. And let's be objective, not just have this blinkered view, which is what he accused everybody of in the past himself, of this anti kind of Russia-phobic attitude to everything. Russia's responsible for all this. I mean, and he's hearing the rhetoric coming out that somehow we think that Russia might be behind these chemical attacks as well. This insane rhetoric, and he's not sitting there going, "Hang on, this makes absolutely no sense. I've heard all this before. I talked about it. It was one of the things I kept raising in the presidential campaign, but I've just kind of forgotten all that." Now, from my perspective, the only way he could be that blinded is that there's people in his inner circle who have given him, whether it's looks like legitimate intelligence, or they're telling things, they've just fed him in such an emotive way that, and it's like what happens. It happens with all people when things they become highly emotive. They can often make completely irrational decisions, and it's
Sure.
like he's still going through this whole emotive angle. Yes, there are children. Well, there's an argument how many children were killed prior to this incident and put in these situations to make it look like this chemical attack happened. There is increasing evidence that that has also happened, because there was a group of people in not that far from where this obviously chemical attack in inverted commas happened, who were kidnapped prior to this event. What happened to those people? were this part of this grand scheme to convey this idea of a chemical attack to frame Assad? Well, it's increasingly looking that that's the case as well. So when you stack all these things up, it's just incredulous. So I mean, it's not just in terms of the damage by what they did in Syria is the problem. It's now all encompassing. It has put the US in terms of their foreign policy. They've got, I mean, they might as well go back 100 years. It's utterly disastrous. It was completely unnecessary. But they've alienated half the world again, who actually thought they were seeing some changes. And the trouble is, at some point, Trump's going to wake up to this, and he's going to have to turn around and say to himself, "What the hell was I privy to? Why the hell did I fall for this?" And I think at some point there will be a purging of the inner circle. There will be some common sense, but the damage is already done. How can he repair that damage? It seems very, very hard because, as we said, the only option is what do you do? Tells the world, "I'm terribly sorry, you made a huge mistake." I mean, you know, this credibility would be in tatters. That he just wouldn't be allowed to do this. So the question then remains: okay, so what's going to be the? And you said the asymmetric response, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think part of the agenda as well, which is utterly ridiculous, was he thinks he could drive a wedge between China and Russia. I mean, there seems to be this angle that I think there's an element of that they think, well, we could conceivably do this. Absolute nonsense. Russia and China are joined at the hip. They would never, ever allow that kind of stupidity to affect their decision making and how they work together. So that was another problem that infuriated the Chinese and infuriate the Russians. So, but the problem is, I think we can accuse Trump of being, you could say he's a neocon, you could say it was nefarious. No, the bottom line is he's guilty of naivety, stupidity, ignorance on a staggering level. And the thing is, one wonders, as we say, how Trump will react when the realization of what happened comes to pass. But one thing I would say is, unlike his predecessors, it's going to hurt him greatly, have a lasting effect and impression on him. How's that going to affect his presidency? And the other question is, of course, is I think in some angle you'd have to say, will he survive 4 years as a president? Even I don't know. I mean, it's something to throw out there, but there is a risk he won't. But I think the thing is, everyone felt, well, if Trump was the last chance. Well, he isn't. If we've said it before, and we're not just saying it now after the event. We talked about this previously. Things will happen whether Trump's president or not president. Things will happen whether the US cooperates or doesn't cooperate. The whole new paradigm's coming in. How it will exactly unfold, people don't know. But I feel this event in Syria it's like the Ukraine. It's pushed the foot hard down on a different accelerator that will take us in a different direction. But there will be a response. But if the neocons seriously think Russia and China are going to respond militarily, well, just look at Ukraine. They just sat back and went, "Do you really think we're going to just stomp into Ukraine and start a war there?"
Exactly.
Absolutely not. So they've got no intention of doing that. So the only other angle is economic.
Right.
Well, we know. And we come back to, we talked middle of March where I said there was this kind of almost, it's the whole thing to do with that day when we had the interest rate hike. Yes. And we saw this, whether the physical gold price took control of the paper. And it seemed like a kind of almost watershed moment. And then we subsequently saw after that, the interbank lending, all this announcements came out. It all seemed to feed into that belief. And I think there was just a casual way of announcing to the world, look, we have this financial system. We're going to move to this new paradigm. We're going to have gold-backed currencies. At some point in the future, we don't know when. And people speculate there's no point. It's happening. The when doesn't really matter.
Right.
I think what happened in Syria has just accelerated that process, and the desire for Russia and China to make that happen has just been, accelerated multifold. And I think that's probably what will ultimately happen. Now, people will always say, when's it going to happen? Who knows when it's going to happen? It doesn't matter whether it's in 6 months, a year, it's irrelevant, or sooner. It is going to happen. But I think the damaging aspect for Washington and for the Trump administration is it may just now happen where Russia and China say, well, I'm sorry, the US, we gave you an opportunity. You've spectacularly failed. We'll just press ahead and do what we do. And of course, in the process, if the economic carnage comes to pass, and let's be honest, we talk about the US, but I mean, the debt junkies have been on the end of the US dollar needle across Europe as well. So
Right.
if the dollar collapses in the US, it's going to cause a collapse across Europe. This is a given. And the UK, I don't try to divorce the UK from Europe, but in terms of the Brexit thing, we kind of can sort of separate them off. But the UK is going to have massive problems. So's mainland Europe. So's the US. So's Canada. All the nations, they're going to have major problems. It's not just the US that will suffer as a consequence of this. And then what's the outcome of this? Well, China, being economically strong, is going to be able to just cherry pick all the assets that it wants. And people will get terrified and think China's taking control. No, they're not. But they will be able to be in a process to rebuild the US. And we're already seeing hints of it with Canada. Canada, I don't know what changed. Something politically changed where the Chinese started to engage with Canada. They joined the AIIB. They talked about trade deals. Something changed. And the Chinese, the other thing is they don't forget in history what nations have done to them. The Chinese are furious with the British because of the Opium Wars.
Right.
The Russians are furious because of the Tsars being overthrown, which was a Rothschild plan, of course.
Right.
And the Chinese are furious because of American policy and what they've done to their nation in the past. All these nations needed to have done is to turn around to the Chinese and say, look, we can't undo history, but we'll apologize for our behavior. We're terribly sorry. We want to build relations. And the Chinese would go, that's fine. But when you go and launch missiles during a state visit, you might as well have got Jinping, put him out in public and slapped him across the face 1,000 times, because that would have been less damaging than the damage, politically and diplomatically by doing what he did during a visit. You just don't do that. And that shows
such arrogance, man. It's such arrogance. It's like, what type of hubris? You have a state visit coming in. China's coming in. I mean, we have to respond very quick. Respond to what? This was a pure slap in the face against President Xi Jinping. Shows the arrogance, and it also proves to both the Russians and the Chinese that they simply cannot trust the United States. The United States is an unreliable partner in global economics, in world peace. Can't do it. Can't trust them. So now they got to move on without him.
And that's the problem. And of course, the mainstream media all tout all this idea that our relations are wonderful with China. Well, no, absolutely they're not. And it's the same, the UK is in exactly the same position. The Chinese have not forgiven the UK. Then I don't think, to be honest, China went with a great deal of expectation when they turned up to meet Trump. But I'll tell you what, if they had no expectation, they had infinitely less than no expectation when they left. And that's the sad reality. And then and then of course people will say, well, but Russia is a huge problem as well, and they've absolutely alienated. I mean, I'd love to be a fly on the wall when Tillerson speaks to Lavrov, because you can guarantee it will be thermonuclear in terms of the language used to him, and a clear indication this will not be tolerated. And seriously, do you really think the world is that stupid? You might be able to fool people in the West with the insane mainstream media, but the rest of the world doesn't buy it. We're fed up of it. We're sick and tired of it. And there are going to be repercussions. Now, if they release intelligence that proves that whoever in the intelligence agencies were behind it, there was coordination between them and obviously the ISIS and other terrorist organizations, hence the coordinated attack at the same time. Whatever there is, that's going to be damaging enough. But it also comes back to the point we've said. I mean, I caught one of the what you did with CJ on the day, and the whole tone, and it was very down. But you made the absolutely valid point and completely correct point. All they have to do is kill the dollar.
That's it.
And ultimately, that is what they're going to do. The dollar is going to die. Now, from the US perspective, and we know it's going to die anyway, it would make eminent sense for the US to say to them, okay, we know this is going to happen. Let's work with you to try and mitigate as many of the problems. But now What stops Russia and China? I mean, it could have happened in 2008. It can happen whenever they want. They can just pull the plug and say, that's it. We've had enough. It's game over. And what do they announce to? Well, we don't know. But put it this way, if they announce, well, we're going to a gold standard. We've got way more gold than we've allowed. These are our plans. This is what we're going to do. The dollar's going to eviscerate overnight. It's game over. Now, the damage to the US and the West is incalculable. But there comes a point where and it's not just the US, because the UK is salivating and supporting, the Trump administration. You got Merkel doing the same, and all these, the EU the EU started off being all, with high blown rhetoric supporting it, and now suddenly they're going, hang on, we're not sure we should have any more military intervention. Suddenly, there's a few people engaging their brains, going, this is not a good idea. But basically, all these Western nations are salivating as though, this is the appropriate action. And probably the biggest thing that they underestimate, they still think that China's some little backwater communist state.
Yeah, exactly.
But, they think that Russia's kind of still some communist backwater. That these nations are nothing like this. And anyone in the West who wants to see the reality, go and visit these countries, see what's going on. China's a great example. They've taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty.
Right.
Now, it might be a one-party state and people see it as a dictatorship. Well, here's the difference. You can become the president in China if you work damn hard and spend 20 years and prove yourself, as Xi Jinping did. And he got it on a meritocratic basis. You can work your way from being a nobody. Well, here's the reality. The UK is a one-party state. The US is a one-party state. But if you or I or anyone else who feel we had the capability wanted to become presidents, prime ministers, or even somebody, high up in the Senate, Congress, or the UK Parliament, we've got no chance. We'd never be afforded that opportunity. You can have that in China. And, they have created a huge middle class, and they are working to take people out of poverty. I don't see much. In fact, we see the reverse in the UK and the US and other nations. More and more people are being driven into poverty, hence why you have this huge problem of 90 odd million people in the US economically inactive, and all the things we've talked about before. That's the reality. But of course, that's the mainstream media. It's just feeding people this notion of, these are weak nations. Well, I mean, the Trump administration decided to create a gunfight with China and Russia, but what, of course, they don't realize is all the US possesses is a kitchen knife in response. And that's the part that people in the West don't realize. They're in the ascendancy militarily, economically. They don't want to dominate the US, but there comes a point where patience runs out. And we know that 12 months ago, the Chinese were threatening to launch a gold-backed yuan, didn't, because, at the time there was the idea, Washington, this is a declaration of war. But the US is far weaker now than it was even 12 months, 18 months, 2 years ago. It's in no position. Yeah, it can roll out all its tanks, its armaments, its ships, and sail all around the world and blow things up and thinks it's doing a great job. It is absolutely doing the complete opposite. And the tolerance level is gone. No one's prepared to put up with it. So the question then remains, when are Russia and China going to react? And what exactly are they going to do? And they most certainly are. Is there any chance the US can turn this around? Well, if maybe Trump would have to pull a rabbit out the hat that none of us can perceive as possible. Maybe he can. But I think the damage is already done, and it's kind of irreparable in terms of relations. And the question is, the US are now, and the West is now a sitting duck, because economically, they've obviously said they're all being junkies on the needle of the US dollar. Well, and once that goes, what's left? Nothing. They have, and you rightly pointed out when you said they'll have no dollars to fight wars, they'll have no dollars to do anything. Their entire financial system will be crippled as a result of this. And I think that's ultimately what will happen. When, as we said, we don't know, but it is. Syria is the knockout punch. The cabal was insane enough to do what they did in Ukraine, which absolutely set the ball rolling to destroy them. And there was a question they were going to be defeated at some point. Now, it may have dragged on. I think it's accelerated. It's not going to drag on as long as we perceive it. I don't know when, and it doesn't really matter. But the knockout punch was the attack in Syria. And I think in history, we'll look back and realize that pretty is the defining moment where we're going to reach the end now. I think we just have to watch very closely what Russia and China do in the coming weeks and months, assess everything that comes out, everything that Putin says, Lavrov says, what the military says, and that will give us a huge indication as to what what they're intending to do. They'll do it in a very coded, diplomatic, polite way, but I think the die's being cast, and very sadly, the US, from my perspective, and the West for that matter, they've grasped defeat from the jaws of defeat from the jaws of victory. It was that profoundly stupid. They had a chance to really show Russia and China that they meant to really change, and now that's been destroyed, and that may end up being Trump's legacy. So, yeah, I was supportive of Trump while he did the right things, but this probably in a presidential sense is probably one of the most spectacularly stupid thing that's ever been done, and the consequences and out as a result of this will be astronomical and profound. And that is a very sad thing to say, but it's reality, I think.
Paul, very well said. This is CJ. Real quick question for you in regards to like the G20 summit. I believe they have one coming up fairly soon. Is that correct?
Yes, I think there is something due soon. Yeah.
So, I mean, I know at the time there was a preliminary discussion regarding perhaps Putin and Trump having a meeting discussion beforehand. What do you foresee happening at that G20 summit?
Okay, I think the critical aspect is not the public rhetoric that comes out of Tillerson and Lavrov's discussion this week. I mean, that won't tell us a lot publicly. It might do. You might be quite surprised, but I think that will set the tone. It's interesting. Putin obviously has no desire to meet Tillerson. I think undoubtedly at some point, Putin and Trump will meet face to face. On a lot depends what happens this week. I think, despite the fact Russia's furious, far more than China. I think China's literally has had enough. Russia probably pretty much has. But there's a side to Russia that says, look, we really would like to resolve this amicably if it's possible. Now, if Tillerson comes along and does a complete 180 privately, then there might be some scope with Putin and Trump to resolve this matter. If Tillerson comes on with the arrogant hubris and carries on with the policy and tries to suggest that Russia should just back off, get out of Syria, let us remove Assad, blah, 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 then the meeting of Trump and Putin may not actually, may not happen. Putin may turn around and say, what the hell's the point? I'm not going to bother. I'm wasting my time talking to you. You would hope that common sense will prevail. If at that point, Trump and Putin meet and there's some understanding, whether it's public, it really doesn't matter, but privately there's an acknowledgement we screwed up badly and we want to do something about it, then that might help to heal the wounds a bit, and then we might start to see some progress. But the question that comes in is just to what extent has their patience run out? I mean, we don't know in diplomatic circles what's been discussed. One thing we did see that came out of it at the UN was the rhetoric coming out from the Russians was about as harsh as I've heard that's come out of UN discussion in terms of their vitriol towards the Americans and their whole handling of the situation. I mean, the Bolivians joined in using Colin Powell and the whole weapons of mass destruction thing. There was a lot of support for that, but the rhetoric was harsh, and to do that in the UN is kind of unusual. Normally it's fairly restrained. I mean, will tempers cool? Possibly, but I think this week will give us a clear indication if there is progress, and I hope there is, because the last thing I want to see is the US and the West getting taken down because of a lack of cooperation. We know there's a problem. We know ultimately the financial system's going to fail. But if someone pulls the plug suddenly and abruptly, it's going to be far worse than if it happened in some managed way because there was cooperation. So this stage is difficult to say. But I think if the meeting this week goes very badly, I wouldn't even be surprised if Putin says there's no point in me talking to Trump. But we'll let's assess what happens this week before we can really comment. But if there is progress, then I think we might see some kind of glimmer of hope that something might change. But at the moment, the vitriol and the anger is probably as strong as it's ever been directed at a US administration. And we know, you look at what happened during the Bush administration, what happened even during the Obama administration. I mean, as much as Obama did a whole bunch of insane, stupid, ridiculous things, the one thing they didn't do is go, well, there was a vote and they backed off and didn't send troops into Syria. If they seriously want to send 150,000, 100,000, 50,000, I don't think they will. I think it's just rhetoric. They just want to go out in the world and appear to be strong, appear to be in charge, appear to be in control. It's all part of that, the rhetoric. But the stupid thing is, who are they trying to fool? Are they just trying to convince the American people? Because I'm sorry, the rest of the world, excluding the Western nations, just laugh at it. They don't believe it. I mean, what I can say is, even 12 months ago, 18 months ago, in diplomatic channels, the US were regarded, well, Washington and the Obama administration were regarded as literally with absolute contempt. They used to laugh at them and say, do you seriously think you're a strong nation anymore? No one buys it. We just don't believe it. That's how strong the rhetoric was privately against the US. Now, can it change? I don't. I at the moment, I think it's highly unlikely, and I think time's running out. The question would be: is how much more is Russia and China prepared to tolerate this before they go, that's it, we're just pulling the plug, it's the end, we're just going to kill the dollar, and we've had enough. And from their perspective, as harsh as that is from the Western perspective, who can blame them for taking that viewpoint?
Yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, I remember so keenly, Paul, the picture of Obama and John Kerry in the ASEAN meetings, where they pushed them over to the wives section, and they were standing with the wives of the leaders, while Putin and Xi Jinping were right in the center. Do you remember those pictures?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been a huge amount of subtle hints.
Yeah.
And it's the one thing, I've said this many times before. If you look at China particularly through the eyes of the West, you'll never understand how they operate.
Correct.
They don't think that way. They don't think like the West. They don't operate. I mean, I've spent a bit of time in China. I've dealt with a lot of Chinese people over the years. They have a completely different way of doing it. And if you work with them in a very polite way and in a courteous way, they will move heaven and earth to help you and work with you. But it has to be reciprocated. But if you stab the Chinese in the back, they never forgive.
Yep.
And that's that's the position we're at. And of course, the one thing we haven't even discussed is the one advantage that Trump had as a president, which he was self-made. He couldn't be blackmailed, coerced in any way, shape, or form. Now, he's taken this military action. He bypassed Congress, launches these preemptive strikes. That may potentially be an Achilles heel for him and make him more malleable to the demands of his inner circle, who don't have the US's best interest necessarily at heart. I mean, after all, could these actions be used to launch an impeachment proceedings against him in the future? It's a possibility.
It's and that's the whole thing that he needs to understand. He's being gamed. He's being conned at such a high level that what the establishment is trying to do is they're trying to alienate his base. His only support base put him in power because we were sick of the unending wars, the perpetual wars. We were sick of the foreign interventions. We wanted a more U.S.-centric domestic policy, and that's what's ushered him into the office, Paul. And for us as supporters to see this, it is alienating and it is culling the entire population of supporters for him. And that's exactly what the establishment wants, because once they're done, stripping away at his support base, then they'll just throw him over to the wolves, man. And then it's over.
Well, this is Johnny. He couldn't have done. I mean, here's the thing. You're absolutely right. He's alienated his own support base in the US, who thought he was everything that he was, or he should have been, and he wasn't in terms of Syria. He's alienated the Russians and the Chinese. If the CIA recommended don't go into Syria, so he's alienated them. He's alienated a large part, a certain section of his inner core of people who he trusts and works with. I mean, he couldn't have done more damage. He's probably alienated other aspects of the intelligence agency. He's probably alienated aspects of the military. I mean, single-handedly, for a whole bunch of different reasons, he's alienated just about everybody, except, of course, his fan club, who now includes the neocons and ISIS.
Oh, wonderful! It's a great group of people to be around with.
Yeah, I mean, because in the future, of course, they'll have his back. I mean, this is the level of crass stupidity that, and it is. But the important fact is, and we have to reiterate it, he's not cabal. He isn't a neocon like a wolf in sheep's clothing. There isn't some deal between Russia and China in this regard. It genuinely just was. I mean, it's very hard to use an adjective that qualifies it strongly enough, but it was just a ridiculously stupid decision on every level. And he will have to face consequences himself on a personal level, professionally, in terms of what the future holds for the nation, depending on how Russia, China react to this. We all know he's very passionate about the future of the US. He was, and in terms of its success and its development. But he's likely plunged the future of his nation into a great period of uncertainty, domestically and internationally, as a consequence of actions that, in a pressure cooker situation, he should have turned around and said to himself, okay, I'm getting all these ideas from different factions saying, you should go to war, you shouldn't go to war, and he should have walked away, given himself some time on his own and said, okay, what is the ramifications if I do this? Does this intelligence stack up? And of course he did none of this. And unfortunately, there's the old saying, you act in haste and repent at leisure. But my goodness, that could never be, more of the reality of what he's going to have to deal with in the future. And it's a very, very sad day. And for me, when the actions happened, it was less about, well, Trump's shown his true colors, or it was more to do with the fact of thinking this is the consequences of his actions, and they will be felt now and in the future. And until we get through the new paradigm and the world really stabilizes, which could take, and we've said, and it will take a number of years, it's not going to happen overnight, there will be unintended consequences for his actions, which will be felt for a long period of time, both in the US and Europe, as a consequence of this. And that's something we're all going to have to face. I'm not trying to sound, like history or get histrionics about it, or, try to upset people. That's the reality. What the outcome is, we have to wait and see. But without a shadow of a doubt, the die's being cast. And will Trump even? I don't know. We said this just earlier. Will Trump survive? I don't know. It might be that he won't even survive as the president. He may do, he may not do. But of course, if the truth comes out, how the hell could he survive as a result of that?
The worst part is, Paul, the worst part in this whole entire thing, this is what's killing me. This is what's killing me. And I want people to pay very close attention to this. This is what kills me. And I think, I don't think anybody's thought of this either. If you look at it, right, he had, what's her name? Susan Rice. Practically gift wrapped with a bow and handed over to him in terms of this whole wiretapping thing. And nothing's become of that. And I don't think anything will. The whole healthcare thing is a debacle. Yeah, I understand that. The whole tax reform thing is probably not going to even happen because of all the gridlock that's in Congress. I get that. The Susan Rice thing is right in front of you. This is the whole wiretap. This is the whole, this is the yarn, the string of yarn that if you pull the entire, pedogate scandal, everything comes apart with it. The connections to the, Clinton foundations, the connections to Obama, the connections to the shadow White House he's operating 2 blocks down the road. All of this comes apart. All he had to do was pull on the string called Susan Rice. So what happened? Days go by, nothing happens with Susan Rice. Nobody's calling her for an indictment. Nobody's, subpoenaing the woman. No one's doing anything. But all of a sudden, a button to launch missiles is put in front of the guy, and he pushes that very quickly, Paul.
Well, yeah, exactly. And when you put it in the context of anything else, but do you know what I think? The one thing Trump lacks, yeah, he may have been very successful in terms of business, but he lacked a real understanding of how the White House and Washington operate. I think he was wide-eyed. He sorely underestimated the job in hand. I mean, he spoke about the horrible mess that he's inherited. I mean, absolutely true. But from my perspective, he's completely underestimated the gravity and the extent of the problems. They're far more vast and all-encompassing than he ever thought was reality. And then, so he started to understand some of the issues. I think he probably was absolutely shocked about some of the revelations that started to come out. But you're absolutely right. He hasn't acted on the things he should have acted on. And the one thing he shouldn't have acted on, he just went, okay, let's just do this. And there was no period of thought. I mean, straight away, almost immediately, it was the kind of war rhetoric. We're going to deal with Assad. I mean, within hours. I mean, it was clearly obvious the inner circle has poisoned his mind. And I do come back now. It will always stick in my head that with the thing with Trump is he's not like your typical president. He will come out and wear his heart on his sleeve. And he kept mentioning about the children. And that was the one thing, it's the emotive angle that will have distorted his perspective on things. And it was intentional because they knew it's the one thing where the red mist in his eyes descend and he couldn't cope with that. He couldn't deal with that. And they knew full well that if they pushed that button with him, he'd push the button. And that's precisely what they did. And he didn't have the foresight to take a step back and go, hang on, what is really going on here? But again, he's underestimating. He almost had this naivety that, well, my inner circle, they couldn't possibly be providing me with information, intelligence, or a perspective that may actually be incorrect, whether it's intentionally or otherwise, is irrelevant because the outcome was the same. Syria was bombed. It doesn't matter why, but he didn't give himself time. He must have had these meetings where he had on the one side possibly the Bannons who were really, really pushing this is a stupid thing to do. And on the flip side, whoever it might be was saying exactly the opposite. And he didn't take the time to work this out. That is where it does seem incredulous. But who knows the pressure? I mean, I'm not making excuses for his decision because there is no excuse. But I have a feeling the pressure cooker was turned up to a maximum deliberately. It was all designed just to get the red mist to descend so he'd make a quick, swift decision, which of course plays beautifully into the hands of exactly the wrong people. But I think that was the MO all along. Here's the point, and we said this earlier, the US and the Russians both knew the Syrians were going to bomb this compound. Mm-hmm. That was a given. I think there was an idea that there was an opportunity they seized to create this idea there was a chemical attack. And as a consequence, they then thought, right, we can push. And it had to happen quickly because if Trump had slept on it for a day or two, common sense would have come to pass and he would have realized we're not doing this. But I think we don't know, we weren't privy to the meetings, but the intensity was turned up such that he just felt compelled to act because I think probably it was fed into him that, if you've got to be strong, Mr. President, you have to take decisive action. The world has to see that you're against this tyranny. Yes, you're against ISIS. Yes, you're against. Well, Assad's also done despicable things. Look what he's done to these children, and it just fried his head. And he went, "Okay, I'm just going to make this decision." And now he meets. He's met Xi. He's now had conversations with the Russians. He's now starting to learn. But how much has he learned? Because he's storming off into North Korea. It doesn't look like he's learned yet the horror of what he's caused by this action, and ultimately the consequences are unknown to him at the present time. But pretty soon there's going to come a point where he's going to get up one day and go, "Oh, I now understand what I've done. I now understand the problem." So perhaps the first action we will see is a purging of the inner circle. Maybe we'll see some announcements coming out soon enough. And I suspect there'll be and of course, who knows, may end up getting purged as a result of it. And of course, he's got family members inside that inner circle. What's their role in it? He's not just going to have to deal with this in a very kind of, well, sorry, so-and-so, you're going to have to leave. If it involves people in his family who are involved in this process, and we don't know what their involvement is, there's a lot of speculation. Maybe they are to a larger or lesser extent part of the problem. what's he going to do if he has to turn around and get rid of them?
Paul,
Then it becomes a family matter.
Paul, that's a very valid point, and that's the question I want to ask you in regards to the last couple of weeks we witnessed Ivanka given an office, right? We've seen the influence of Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner was stated that he was going to be reviewing government operations, an oversight to see where they could streamline and bring it closer to the business aspect. But yet we see Kushner in Iraq. How much influence does Jared Kushner do you think has in Trump's decision? And then more importantly, do you think that could have led to the decision for the strikes in Syria?
I think certainly. I mean, I think, we talked before, and Kushner, let's just set him aside, is a very intelligent guy, very smart, very capable, probably definitely deserved some role in Washington. However, once again, he bit off more than he could chew. He wasn't really didn't have the experience. I mean, undoubtedly, I think he was probably far more instrumental in Trump being elected than people realize. So there might be an element where Trump went, well, this guy's really helped me. I know he's capable. He's done all these things in terms of business. And he's given him a position, probably an elevated position that he wasn't ready to assume. And I think he has been probably quite influential in terms of decisions that Trump makes. Certainly, we know he's in Iraq. We know he's been, I mean, what his remit is specifically is a bit hard to pin down because it seemed to be all encompassing. But is Kushner possibly one of the problems in terms of, it might well be the case? And in which case, if that is true, how does he handle that? Because what's he going to do? Say to his members of his family, sorry, I'm just going to have to fire you from the administration. If that indeed is the case, and we don't know, and it might not be the case, but if that ever comes to pass, that's a huge problem in itself. But once again, it's the one thing that people take actions and they never think of the unintended consequences of what that might. I mean, we might have had, I don't know, maybe Kushner was on one side of the fence and Bannon and others were on the other, and they're both having a heated discussion and disagreement about, policy in Syria. Well, what happens if it comes to pass at some point in the future that if it was Bannon, for example, that, well, actually Bannon was correct, he made the right call. Hang on, you, Kushner, whoever else it might be, you were on the other side of the fence, for argument's sake, making the incorrect call. That's going to have huge personal consequences for him. So, and Trump is, he is, whatever people say, and I know there's all this rhetoric coming out that, somehow Trump was already being blackmailed because he'd committed all these kind of heinous crimes. That's absolute rubbish. That is not who Trump is. Trump he does care about people, and he's going to have to face the consequences at some point of his actions, because the realization is going to hit home. He's not stupid. He's perfectly intelligent to understand that. How does he deal with that? And when it becomes something that could be a personal matter in terms of his family, that just makes it doubly more difficult. And there's an argument that says, do you really want to work with your family? I mean, there's a whole saying in business, never work with your family. Well, most of the time that's absolutely true, but there's a world of difference between running a business and having, your sons, daughters, or anyone else involved. But when you're the president of the United States and you're making these kind of decisions that are going to be influenced, rightly, wrongly, or however, by family members, that's a whole different ballgame. And he's got to deal with that as well. How do you handle that? Well, if I was in his position, what you do? I mean, it's extremely difficult, but in the end, he's going to have to deal with the fact there is clearly issues within his inner circle, because they must have, whoever it is, have given him bad advice to be, when on the face of it, for all the things we've discussed in the last hour or so, it was absolutely evident that it was a ridiculous decision to make if anyone had thought about it. Well, so it's going to cause huge problems for him on so many levels, and on a personal level, notwithstanding what it's going to do to him, potentially do to the US. And he does care about the US greatly. He passionately wants the US to be successful. But we also said in the past, and we're not just saying it now after the event, I said, and I've said it repeatedly, Trump will make decisions. He'll stand by his decision, but he's likely and he will make mistakes. Well, unfortunately, the first major decision he's made in regards to foreign policy wasn't just a mistake or an error. It's an absolutely grave error with huge consequences.
Yeah.
But he is ultimately, he stood up and made the decision. I don't doubt it. I mean, people say, oh, well, we know presidents in the past were just mouthpieces. I do think ultimately he sanctioned it and agreed to it. And that from a neocon perspective, that's perfect. Because they'll say, well, Trump made the decision. Trump says, yeah, I made the decision. I don't doubt he did, but boy, yeah, he will make mistakes, but could he make a bigger mistake in the context of everything? I very much doubt it. Well, apart from pressing a nuclear button, which he's not going to do, you couldn't make a bigger mistake on so many levels as we've highlighted in the whole of the conversation we've had.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also the point you bring up the point where Trump was mumbling over and over again, "Oh, the children, the children, the children," and he seemed like kind of rattled. Like he seems really pained.
Uh-huh.
Is it maybe even possible there was maybe a threat against his own children, maybe his grandchildren? Maybe they're
Well, I get
manipulating that way.
it's possible. I doubt it. I mean,
Yeah,
anything's possible. I mean, but your rationale for suggesting it is a very good point because clearly, he was absolutely rattled. I mean, he was very impassioned. I mean, okay, ultimately, he's completely flawed and ridiculous decision to make, but he made it on the basis, and he was very rattled, very upset.
yeah,
He was in his own head. He was furious with what had happened, and of course, whoever suggested to him it was a sad and it could have been a multitude of sources were responsible, but ultimately, on that basis, he just went, "Well, I'm going to have to make the decision, and I'm going to act on it." Now, as a president, you can't do that. But unfortunately, because he is passionate, he does care about people, and that was his Achilles heel in a sense. And somebody realised this and went, "Well, if that's his Achilles heel, we can use that to our advantage." Now, the whole question is if Syria, and this is the irony, if Syria hadn't bombed that compound, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation today. It was just a set of circumstances where they saw it as an opportunity to be able to concoct a story and to take action accordingly. But the ultimate thing is, of course, is the neocon angle in the US, which is a diminishing force but still exists. That's the whole rhetoric. They're just war hungry. They want war. And they probably think, or know in reality, the US economy is weak. And often the whole point in history we've seen, let's go to war because war will stimulate the economy. It'll take everyone's mind off economic reality. But the world's different.
yeah. It is a different
We're
world.
not
It's
in
not
this. Yeah,
unipolar. Yeah, it's not gonna.
yeah.
It's not change anything for the U.S. if we go to war. It doesn't do anything for us economically. Not anymore.
No, and that's the thing they're all missing, and the point. And also the fact is, the world's so different. I mean, yes, in days gone by, the US could have done this and got away with it, and probably the world would have backed off, and that'd be the end of it. Now we have strong nations like Russia, China, who will simply not tolerate it, and who are saying, you can launch all the missiles you like, you can do what you like. It doesn't materially change anything. You're not becoming strong. We're not going to back down and walk out of Syria. We're not going to.
Right.
I mean, the whole thing in North Korea is a classic example of the fact that we've seen this. I mean, we'll see what ultimately happens. But do they seriously imagine that this meeting went so wonderfully well with Xi Jinping, and all these deals are in the pipeline, and everything's wonderful? But by the way, we're just going to go steamrolling towards North Korea, which is going to do, again, antagonize the Chinese like there's no tomorrow. It proves the point that the meeting they had was an utter disaster. Trump came away with nothing. And what's the US reaction to that? Oh, let's look militarily strong and go and decide to go on whatever they intend doing in North Korea, and it might just all be hot air. But again, do the very thing that upsets the very nations you want on side. I mean, it's incredulous, and that's the concern. It's almost like the whole North Korea thing. It's like, okay, they haven't pushed any buttons yet or done anything, but it's the same kind of incredulous behavior that they, without launching the missiles, they did in Syria. I mean, how many
Right.
times do they have to learn? Don't poke the bear and don't start upsetting the Chinese, because the ramifications are going to be huge. But I think that to a certain extent, there's an arrogance inside the neocons. There's this arrogance that, will still prevail. We're still going to come out on top. And
we're an
also,
exceptional stand.
and I think in a sense, when Trump said he wants to make America first, he wasn't doing that from a neocon perspective. He just was saying, I'm going to put America's interests first. I don't want to stomp all over the rest of the world. Well, now he's actually stomped all over the rest of the world, and as a consequence, he's put America's own interest to the bottom of the pile. That's what he's got to also recognize. How long is that going to take? Well, he hasn't got a lot of time, because, to use the oil tanker analogy, this oil tanker needs to be turned around on a quarter or something like that. It's that tight a schedule, and if he doesn't, and thus far, we haven't seen any evidence of that, then there are going to be serious consequences, geopolitically, probably economically. But as ever, Russia and China will do things at their own pace, at their own time. They never rush. They never make rash decisions. They think about the consequences of what they're going to do and their actions. Unlike Western nations, who will just come out with the most ridiculous vitriol. I mean, we've seen, and the UK is as bad. Let's not just keep pointing the finger. The comments coming out. I mean, Boris Johnson, who's the foreign secretary, is now not going to talk to Lavrov.
So stupid.
I think it's more to do with it. Well, he's probably not going because he's terrified of what Lavrov's going to say. And also it might be, leave it to the big boys, Boris. We're going to send Rex over, and he's going to deal with these Russians. He'll sort the problem out. And when he's softened them up, you can go in and be this kind of support guy. It's that level of stupidity. But I tell you, I hope we see a press conference with Lavrov and Tillerson, because the body language will probably be hugely revealing in terms of what was actually said.
Absolutely.
But, I hope that some common sense prevails, but I am not confident. But ultimately it is, whether Trump's president or isn't president, nothing's going to change. In the end, the dollar will be eviscerated. It'll be the end of the cabal. The cabal have to be destroyed. Now, Trump started off trying to do that, very much so, but he's unwittingly, from my perspective, done something that plays into their hand. It doesn't mean that the cabal's going to triumph. They're not going to triumph. We're not going to see the deep state succeed and take the US back over. It's not going to happen. But what he's done is so damaging potentially to the US as a nation. The nation, as we said, that he puts America first. Well, he couldn't have done anything worse to put America last.
Right, exactly. The argument that war is good for the economy is an obsolete paradigm that many that are the neocons and the establishment, the members of the cabal, still adhere to. And that argument can be simply destroyed in just one simple sentence. We don't have any manufacturing. Yeah. So how's war? War or the Cold War, all these things were great for the economy because we actually made things. What are they going to do? They're going to stimulate. They're going to have war, right? And then stimulate the economy. Why? With what? Everybody getting jobs at McDonald's or bartending jobs or waitressing jobs. Is that how they planning on creating a recovery, Paul?
Well, exactly. The basis of recovery, as you say, is strong economic growth through manufacturing and innovation and entrepreneurship. So we have businesses that are allowed to thrive. And that's the other thing. The whole basis in the Western world is if you and I come out with this amazing business plan where we could create 100,000 jobs in the US and maybe 20,000 in the UK, it's fantastic business opportunities, stimulate a lot of growth. Someone's going to look at it and go, no, sorry, you're not allowed to do this. We're not going to permit this. It can't happen. Will you either disappear with your idea, or there'll be consequences. Or I'll tell you what, we'll buy the business off you for $1, and you just be grateful that we didn't kill you in the process. It's that kind of insane kind of perspective that the West has,
right?
And it's absolutely right. It's not going to stimulate growth. The US is going to have to, and the West and the UK is going to have to take some very strong medicine. We're going to have to redevelop our economy, and at the moment, the US and the UK is in no position to do that. I fear as the risk, and we've talked about this, that the US risks isolation because of their policy. And we said, if Clinton had been elected, the world would have isolated them. That is a risk, but I also see that the UK risks very much being isolated with the similar kind of consequences. And this is the problem, that they just have this arrogance, and the British have this arrogance that somehow, we're above all this. I mean, rather like Trump had an opportunity, the UK had an opportunity with Brexit. It could be the most wonderful thing from a UK economic perspective, but you can guarantee there isn't one person who has any position of authority and influence over this who will make it work. They will screw it up completely. It will turn into an absolute debacle, and economically the UK will suffer as a result of it. Never mind the fact that the EU will play hardball. There isn't anyone capable, and this is why, if this was China and they had Brexit, they'd have the greatest minds in China working on this, going, right, we're really going to make this work for China as a nation. And these people will be put to the job. They do it successfully and efficiently. And that's the difference. If the same would happen in Russia, they would have the best people doing the job. And this is why the West will fail until we get over this idea. And we have true meritocracy. We actually have a democracy where the right people do the right job, whoever it might be. There's probably countless people out there doing very mundane jobs who actually, if put in a position of authority in some capacity, would do a great job. We have to recognize that and bring that to the fore. And that's not going to happen. At some point in the future, maybe it is ultimately, you have to kill the dollar to wake the Western world up to the reality. And then they'll say, okay, what the hell are we going to do to resolve these problems? I think the longer we kind of pretend that things are all right, we have all these phony markets and endless kind of scandal to do with it's LIBOR, it's Forex, whatever it is. The longer this carries on and nothing's done about it, people in the West just think, oh, nothing's changing because I'm perfectly happy. I've got my job. There's no issues for me. But it might just take dumping the ton of manure on their doorstep. So they open the door and go, what the hell's that smell? And why the hell can't I get out the door? Then they're going to go, okay, there's a major problem. Something needs to be done. And in reality, it sadly looks like that is exactly what will happen. And it's the only way to shake the West. And if ultimately, though, we have to look back in history and say, well, destroying the dollar was the only way to destroy the cabal in totality and to bring an end to the insanity, then as hard as that's going to be, and the reality is it's going to create a huge problem. We have to do it's going to happen. It has to happen. And I think we come back full circle. That's precisely why Syria is that moment in history where it's the knockout punch. Yeah, the cabal's punch drunk staggering all over the place after Ukraine has been for the last 3 years. It's just been now smacked between the eyes. It's out for the count. It's game over. The problem is, I mean, they still to some extent don't realize it, but they've been in intensive care for 3 years, and that's self-evident. And people said to me, "Why'd you say the cabal's dead and finished?" Well, they are. That's why they're in intensive care. If you switch off life support, the US dollar, they die. Now there's been a tolerance, but we're at the point now where the ICU is going to be switched off. It's game over. And in a way, unfortunately, these actions have brought it upon the US and the Western world as a result of it, because of some crass, stupid action that at some point in history, people, I think, will reflect on this moment as being that point in time where that was the action that caused it, rather like Ukraine was, as we said previously.
Absolutely. Paul, very, 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 you've given us a lot of things to definitely chew on, consider. A lot of interesting things are definitely happening. And I think in the next couple of days, man, let's see what happens. I mean, my intelligence insider, the guy back in March said April the 6th, there's going to be an action take place. Watch for that date. And just like he said, boom, it happened. Now he's saying within the next 8 days from that strike on April the 6th, there should be another event somewhere. Let's see what happens. If there's a strike on North Korea, it should be interesting, to say the least. And I don't know what some of the details are, but do you think also, because I know that China is looking to remove Kim Jong-un at some level, so they just might let that go through and kill two birds with one stone. Remove Un and have the cabal stuck in a mire at the same time. That's also a possibility.
That is a possibility, because ultimately Korean unification is going to happen at some point.
Yeah.
And how's that going to come about? Well, yeah, you've got to get rid of that regime to enable that to happen. I mean, it is entirely possible that there is some concerted action in that regard, but the noises coming out of Beijing, they don't seem particularly happy about the US steamrolling towards North Korea. I mean, it could just all be hot air. We've seen this kind of nonsense happening in the South China Sea, and everyone foams at the mouth saying World War III is going to happen. Of course, it never does, and it never will. So
Right.
we have to. But of course, the interesting thing is, from what you're saying, if the timeline fits in and something's expected a week or so after Syria, then the question then comes in: well, if if the source you've got's aware of this, who else is aware of it? Pretty much, you can expect Russia and China to be aware of it. If they are aware of it, what are they going to? What's their countermeasure to that? Are they already planning something? I mean, as I said, I think the whole North Korea thing, if it isn't some idea that it's a time, regime change that suits all parties, if it isn't there, then the obvious question would then be, okay, are Russia and China allowing them to go to North Korea because they're setting the trap? If they're setting the trap, then what is the trap, and what do they intend doing? Well, so yeah, who knows? The next few weeks, could be extremely interesting, and it certainly will be one way or the other. But ultimately, people always go down, well, is this the defining moment where we have this huge, reset, whatever change? There's no way of being able to quantify that. Everything's event driven. There's a whole bunch of processes that start. It's like a slow motion domino effect. The first event happens, it knocks the first. The second domino then is lined up, that gets knocked over. It's not this high speed rattle, and 1,000 dominoes fall simultaneously. It's a very kind of slow measured process, but there's no doubt the Syrian airstrike, the Xi Jinping's visit to Trump in Florida, that was a whole new event driven scenario that's in process and is starting. That could very well be the one that is ultimately the catalyst, which causes the whole new paradigm, the new reset. It's probably very likely to be. How many steps are in this process? Well, no one can tell. I mean,
Yeah.
I wouldn't begin to try and guess what they are. But if the US and coalition forces decide to up the ante, they're just going to accelerate that process even quicker. That you can say with absolute certainty. If, for example, they'd never gone into Ukraine and done that, I don't think you and I would have been talking the way we are now. I think we'd have been probably talking about, we're starting to see a little bit of bilateral trade happening between nations, and maybe some evidence of some changes politically in certain nations, but not the kind of acceleration we've seen, particularly in the last year or two. And I think once again, this is the catalytic moment for massive changes happening, and we just have to keep observing what's going on, seeing all the subtle and unsubtle signs. And as ever, it's this gigantic million piece jigsaw puzzle, which we have to kind of piece together and assess and understand what's going on. But there's people today who'll disagree with what I've said, but I absolutely stand by it, because from my perspective, that's what's exactly happening. The future's unclear. Maybe the Trump administration can pull a rabbit out of the hat. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll U-turn and go, okay, Syria was a grave mistake. We can't publicly admit it. Okay, let's just back off and not do this ever again. That's a possibility. But we don't know. I mean, we just don't know, because Trump acted emotively on something he shouldn't have. Is he going to go away and act emotively again if the buttons are pushed to make him think that? It's a possibility. So, based on what you've said, maybe in the next few days we'll see some interesting developments coming out of North Korea, maybe again in Syria, or maybe something else. But we just have to keep an eye on it. But I remember when we talked about this kind of watershed moment with paper gold and physical gold, and a lot of people were like, I guess, kind of thinking, is this the build up to the reset? It's not like that. And it doesn't mean that necessarily at all. It just means it's another big shift. But the amount of things that have to change in this world to remove the cabal is enormous. It is so huge, and not just one huge event's going to be the final domino that topples it. But I think we've just moved into a different paradigm in terms of this shift. I think we're moving to further and further towards the ultimate goal. And maybe the next week or two will give us a clearer indication of what's going to happen. But this is why I'm not going to get sucked into dates. I'm not going to suggest anything happens, because there's people saying, "Oh, I'm expecting this big event to happen in March or April or May or whenever." I tell you, I think it'll happen when we least expect it. We'll just get it one day and go, "Wow, that happened. Where did that come from?" It'll be that kind of moment. It's not going to be telegraphed, because it's like any intelligence operation. You're not going to telegraph something weeks and months in advance. So when people come out and say, "Well, I'm expecting this definitive moment to happen at this point in time," it just makes no sense to me, because who, even if it was reality, would say, "Well, on this date, I don't know, whatever date it might be, we're going to introduce the gold standard. We're going to have a gold-backed currency. We're going to do X, Y, and Z, but we're just going to privately discuss this as the date it's going to happen, because undoubtedly it's going to leak somewhere." They just wouldn't do that. That's not how it works, and it never will. So I think we need to be mindful when people pin dates on things. But certainly you can pin dates, like you said, someone suggested to you something would happen on the 6th of April. But that's just that's a significant event, but it's not the absolute game-changing event. It may be the catalyst, of course, for the game-changing event.
Oh, sure, right.
And that's absolutely true. And I think it probably the 6th was the game-changing event in many regards, and time will tell in that whether that actually comes to pass. But so yeah, I think that's a perfectly reasonable standpoint. But I noticed, I read some of the comments where people were saying, "Oh, well, you were supporting Trump and you're being proved to be wrong." No one's been proved to be wrong. It's absolute nonsense.
You got to be intellectually honest. We support somebody who's doing the right thing, but as soon as he starts slipping up, we're going to call it. We're not like some sycophant leftists who, no matter what their candidate does, is going to continue to support the candidate. We don't do that here. If the candidate is doing the wrong thing, we're going to call them out, Paul.
And you absolutely have. And the point is, the alternative is, if you didn't get Trump in, you'd have had Clinton. So imagine where we would have been now. Well, it beggars belief exactly what would have happened in the first 80 days or so of the Clinton administration. So from my perspective, he was obviously the better candidate. I don't agree with everything he says, but there was enough noises to suggest that he intended to do good things. It doesn't mean he won't in the future, and he might be able to turn all this around and deal with it. But you're absolutely right. On a day-by-day basis, if he comes out with nonsense, we're gonna lay it on the line. And I don't think we can be any more, vociferous in terms of our criticism of him without using expletives, which frankly don't achieve anything. It's pointless. We've made the point. I don't think we can be any stronger in our condemnation of the action. But I think it's too easy for people to jump to conclusion and assume, "Oh, well, he was always this. He was always going to do this. This is, this was a fait accompli. It was an inevitability, and he's just shouting, same old. Cabal's still in charge. Nothing's changed." That's absolutely not the case, and it's clearly self-evident that I think in the last week or two prior to the whole Syrian debacle, it's like the machinery of Washington consumed him. And that also probably contributed to the fact of why he made such a very, very poor decision. And that's, we can sit here, we can talk about this and have some hindsight and go away and think about it. But you imagine being the president of the US and under that kind of intense pressure. Could we make wrong decisions? Well, quite likely we can. Does it make us instantly cabal? No. Does it make us inherently a fundamentally evil, nasty person? No, it doesn't. There's plenty of people who've made poor decisions. It's just unfortunately he's become the president of the US at probably the worst time anyone could ever be the president of the US. Yes, he inherited the worst mess. The mess was being polite. It's absolutely far worse than any other president's ever inherited. Who'd want to take on that mantle? He knew what he was taking on. He knew full well the extent, not necessarily how to do the job, but he knew it was a huge problem and a huge challenge. And sadly, he's made a very, very regrettable mistake. And time will tell, but you might be right. I think let's see what happens in the next week or two in terms of foreign policy and and the Lavrov meeting with Tillerson, and then maybe we talk in a week's time, we'll have a better indication again of what's actually going on. But at the moment, it looks very precarious, and I'm not seeing any evidence of concessions coming out of Russia and China. But maybe Tillerson can smooth it over. But will he have the foresight to do so? I don't know. I mean, is he making a lot of noises because he feels that he needs to make those noises? We just don't know. But I think the Tillerson-Lavrov meeting will be another defining moment in our understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. With that being said, Paul, we're pretty much at the end. Why don't you plug your website, your special subscription for members, as well as all the other things you guys do over at the Sirius Report.
Okay, well, first off, thanks very much. Obviously, we've got the website, thesiriusreport.com. That's SIRIUS. Is a lot of free content on there. Obviously, yes, as V said, we have the premium content. We do 5 podcasts a week. Sometimes we do a double podcast a week, depending on what the circumstances. But it averages at 5 a week each week. It's $4.75 a month. You get all the updates. We do all the in-depth analysis globally, what's going on. I mean, we think it's good value for money, and V's very kindly promoted. He doesn't get paid a penny, by the way, for doing this. It's not like he earns any money out of it. He believes in what we're doing, and obviously, we really appreciate that, as we do for all the subscribers. And and thank you to all them, obviously, who have subscribed. We obviously have the Twitter page at the Sirius Report. We have the Facebook page, the Sirius Report. And I guess in essence, we obviously have the YouTube channel, but obviously, and many thanks to all the people who've got in touch with all the recent issues I've had personally. I don't want to discuss it, but I will get back in touch with every one of you, because we appreciate your support and all your thoughts and kind words. And thank you very much for having us on the show. We really appreciate it, and we really enjoy the time. And it's not nice talking about these difficult subjects, but it's something we have to tackle, and we will continue to do so. And we will, rather like Rogue Money, we're going to be objective, straightforward, and honest about things. And we're not going to pull punches, and we're not going to defend anyone who shouldn't be defended.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very well said, Paul. With that being said, folks, again, you can follow us on roguemoney.net. You can check out Paul at thesiriusreport.com. And also you can follow him on at the Sirius Report for his Twitter account, as well as you can follow us at the Rogue Money. And again, be back here next week, because things are fast and furious. They are fast-moving events that are occurring right now. And I'm sure that everything we talked about, there's going to be more things to add coming next week. With that being said, we'll see you all back next week with the Sirius Report with London Paul. Thank you all for listening in. Take it away, CJ.